Hello biology buddies, and welcome to lesson 4 in the B3 infection and response unit. This lesson is going to be about vaccines, and the previous lesson, lesson 3 on the immune response, is super important in terms of understanding how vaccines work. So if you haven't done that lesson yet, please do so. If you understand the immune response and memory cells, vaccines are really simple to understand. But if you don't, they get quite a bit more complicated. So make sure you've done that bit first, please. Vaccines, some people consider to be a little bit controversial because of nonsense that's spread on things like Facebook, Instagram, and other forms of social media. If you're going to take one thing away from this lesson, please let it be that you should not be getting your scientific and medical advice from social media. The beautiful thing about those platforms is anybody can post whatever they want, and the terrible thing about those platforms is anybody can post whatever they want. There's no sort of peer review or checking of anything that goes on. So please do not get your medical and scientific information from social media. Get it from the experts. There's a reason that they go to school and train for as long as they do. It's so that they can actually become experts and not people who just spout off nonsense. So that rant is over. Let's take a look at what we're going to be doing in today's lesson. We're going to talk about what a vaccine is, specifically what are the important things that are in a vaccine. We're going to explain how vaccines provide immunity, and again, that's going to tie back to the stuff that we did in the previous lesson, lesson 3 on the immune response. And then we're going to have a look at a style of question that comes up quite often on the exams, which are evaluate questions, and we will evaluate the use of vaccines. So what is a vaccine? What's the purpose of a vaccine? As we talked about in lesson 3, a vaccine is essentially a practice go for your immune system. They train the immune system to recognize a pathogen. Remember, those are the microorganisms that cause disease: bacteria, virus, fungus, protist. And it trains the immune system on how to make the appropriate antibodies. Now that has to do with the memory cells. Remember that after the primary immune response, your body has figured out, your leukocytes have figured out how to make the correct antibodies. Once the pathogen's been defeated and destroyed and it isn't in the body anymore, the memory cells, a special type of white blood cell, a leukocyte, remembers how to make the antibody specific to that pathogen. And remember, it has to have a very specific shape so that it can attach to the antigen. Once you have those memory cells, you are effectively immune against that disease, because if the pathogen comes back, your body will be able to fight it off because it can quickly make the antibodies. So one way to think about vaccines is a primary immune response without the symptoms. So you give the person the antigens to practice on, but they don't actually get ill. And you might be asking, well, how can you do that? And the answer is what is in the vaccine. The most important thing that's in the vaccine is the antigens, because that is what the body, the immune system, is going to be practicing on and learning to make the antibodies to fit. Often the vaccine contains a dead pathogen or a weakened pathogen. And what we mean by that, for example, if it was a bacteria, you could put dead bacteria into the person. The dead bacteria still have the antigens on the outside, so the immune system, the leukocytes, still figure out how to make the correct antibodies. Or you can have a weakened, a live version of the pathogen, but a weakened one. And what that usually means is that it's not able to reproduce. And we talked about how for a pathogen to cause disease, it's not just going to attack the body. There needs to be lots of them. So as soon as they get into the body, they start reproducing like crazy, and then they cause the disease. So if you put a live pathogen into somebody, but weaken it so that it can't reproduce, that will work just as well. Sometimes you're not going to have the pathogen at all. You're just going to have the antigens. Okay? Often if you get a question, what's in a vaccine, it will be a 2-mark question. 1 mark will be for using the word pathogen, and then the other mark will be for using the word antigens or for using the word dead or weakened. So if you say a vaccine has a pathogen in it, you would get 1 mark out of 2. If you said that it has antigens, you would get 1 mark out of 2. If you said it has the antigens for that pathogen, you would get 2 marks. Or if it's a dead pathogen, you would get 2 marks, 1 for dead and 1 for pathogen. How do they work? We've already kind of been through this. It's a practice run for the immune system. The leukocytes, the special white blood cells that make antibodies, learn how to make the correct antibody and then store that information in the memory cells, but the pathogen can't make the person ill. And again, it's either a dead pathogen or it's a weakened one. There's not enough there. For example, if it was bacteria, there's not enough toxins that are being released. If it's a virus, it's not infecting your cells, etc. Once you have the correct memory cells for that pathogen, just like if you went through the primary immune response from having that pathogen actually infect you, you have the memory cells, you are now immune. So take away the idea that vaccines equal immunity. Some people can't be vaccinated. A lot of the times this has to do with their immune systems. So let's start with the last 3, the 3 who shouldn't be. And this is because their immune system isn't strong enough. People with compromised immune systems, so for example, people who have AIDS or late-stage HIV, people who have problems with their immune system shouldn't get all the vaccines. They definitely shouldn't get a live vaccine. Sometimes they can deal with just the antigens. Pregnant women have suppressed immune systems. One of the things that happens in a woman's body when she becomes pregnant is the immune system actually intentionally gets weaker. And very young babies who don't have a developed immune system yet. You'll see for different diseases, there's a different vaccination schedule. That's when the baby's supposed to get different vaccines. And a lot of that has to do with the stage that the baby's immune system is developed to. So a newborn baby doesn't really have an immune system. They actually have lots of antibodies floating around in their blood that come from their mother, and those keep them safe from most diseases until their own immune system can grow. But you wouldn't want to vaccinate them because there's no point. They can't make the memory cells. So some people you don't vaccinate because their immune system is not strong enough. And then some people are allergic or have a really bad reaction to one of the other chemicals that's in a vaccine. And this is really, really, really rare. For example, I think for the measles, they say it's about 1 in 100,000 people will have an adverse reaction to the vaccine. And those people might not be vaccinated because of that. So most people can be vaccinated, should be vaccinated. All the medical science points to that to help decrease the prevalence of disease in society, but some people can't be vaccinated. This is important because of the idea of herd immunity. Okay? Whenever I hear herd immunity, I think of some animals that are cornered by a lion or a tiger or something like that, and you have a group of animals, and what they will do is put the youngest, the weakest ones in the middle and then form a ring around them so that the weak one is protected by all of the strong ones. It's the exact same idea here, except instead of a lion or a tiger, what we have are pathogens. If enough of the population is vaccinated, if enough of the population is immune to the pathogen, that means that there won't be that pathogen around in the population, right? If everybody's immune, they can't pass it on. So the few people who are not vaccinated, the ones who can't be because they're pregnant or because of their compromised immune system or their allergic reactions or what have you, those people will be protected. And the reason they'll be protected is they will never come into contact with the pathogen. Pathogens don't just appear out of nowhere, they have to be passed on. We looked in lesson number 2 about the different ways that it can be spread. If nobody around you has a pathogen, there's no way that you're going to catch it. So if enough people are immune and can't get the pathogen, then that means that people who are not immune will be protected. That's what the idea of herd immunity is. We're going to look at evaluating vaccines now, and whenever we talk about an evaluation question, you want to look at pros and cons or benefits and costs or advantages and disadvantages. There are 2 super obvious advantages to vaccines. Number 1, the vaccine gives you immunity. I cannot stress how important that is. There's so many diseases that have been almost completely eradicated because of vaccines that used to cause death, used to cause suffering, and now because of vaccines, we don't have to worry about them as long as people get vaccinated. So they provide immunity to serious diseases. That's going to save lots of lives. It's also going to prevent suffering. Whenever there is a global epidemic, whenever there's a global pandemic or epidemic, one of the first things that people try and do is come up with a vaccine, because that can have a massive effect. A pandemic is a disease that is spreading in multiple countries. I think you can probably come up with a pandemic that's happening currently. And an epidemic is within one country. So essentially, an epidemic is inside a country if a disease is spreading out of control. And then if that crosses borders and becomes a pandemic, that means that it's going out of control in a lot of different countries. Interestingly, the things that make our modern society so interesting and so exciting, like airplane travel and things like that, are also things that increase the chance of a pandemic happening. Because in the past, if you could only get from one country to the other by walking or going on horse or something like that, you wouldn't have a lot of international travel, you wouldn't have a lot of people spreading. Whereas now, if somebody picks up a disease in one country, flies across the world to another country and starts spreading the disease, you can get things spreading out of control really quickly. So at the moment, they are currently working on vaccines for the COVID-19 virus. And the idea is if they can come up with vaccines and start mass producing them, then in theory, you can give everybody immunity to the virus, and that then prevents anybody from getting ill and eventually shuts it down completely. Vaccines take a long time to develop. They are part of the drug development process. We're going to be talking about that in lesson number 6. And these things take time. At the moment, they're saying a vaccine might be a year to a year and a half away. That seems like a long time, but if it was 10 years ago, that might be 10 or 20 years. And longer ago than that, it might be 20, 30, 40 years to develop a vaccine. So 1 to 1.5 years is not actually that long of a time to develop a vaccine. So fingers crossed they get that sorted. Risks of vaccines: in some cases, very rarely, they don't work, and then the person doesn't have immunity. Now, they wouldn't have immunity anyways if they weren't taking the vaccine, but it would certainly be a shock if you thought you were immune to a disease because you had a vaccine and then all of a sudden you caught it. There's also a very small percentage of the population that can have an allergic or bad reaction to the chemicals in the vaccine, and we talked about that with the people who shouldn't be vaccinated. Now, that is very rare. Again, for the measles vaccine, the MMR, it's about 1 in 100,000. So quite a small percentage. Often there's some controversy that comes up, like I said at the beginning of the lesson, in social media about autism and vaccines. So there was a doctor who's no longer a doctor called Andrew Wakefield who proposed the idea that the MMR vaccine was linked to autism, and that led to a lot of people choosing not to vaccinate their children. That research was flawed. He made mistakes and bad assumptions, and it's since been completely disproven. There are no medical evidence, there's no medical evidence whatsoever that there's a link, a correlation between autism and vaccines, particularly the MMR vaccine. And unfortunately, that scare, which was published in newspapers and has since been retracted, caused some people to not get their children vaccinated, and then that increased the risk to those children, but also to all the people who can't get vaccinated, the ones that we had before. So people with compromised immune systems, pregnant women, people who have allergic reactions and things like that. So it's led to actually some diseases like measles popping up in places in developed countries where you really wouldn't expect it, provided that people were actually vaccinating their children. What does an evaluate question look like? You might have a question on an exam that says evaluate the use of vaccines. They might give you a little blurb, a little story ahead of time. But essentially, if you see the word evaluate, you need to do some very specific things. These questions will usually be worth between 4 and 6 marks, and you can use that as a guide to try and figure out how many different things you should be talking about. Regardless if it's 4, 5, or 6 marks, you definitely want to do 3 things. Number 1, give evidence for. So what are the benefits of vaccines? What are the advantages of vaccines? You want to give evidence against, and then, risks of vaccines or disadvantages of vaccines, and then last but not least, make a conclusion. You can make the conclusion really explicit in your answer, make it really obvious that what you're saying is your conclusion with 2 very simple words. You can start your sentence with, in conclusion, and then you decide if you're for or against vaccines. It's really important to recognize that when you're writing your conclusion on a test or an exam, you don't lose marks for whether or not the examiner, the person marking, agrees or disagrees with you. If you present evidence for vaccines and you present evidence against vaccines, and those are valid arguments, and then you say at the end, in conclusion, I think that vaccines are wrong or shouldn't be used because blah, 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 and you use some of the evidence that's in your text, you'd still get the marks. If you write, in conclusion, I think vaccines are a great idea because of blah, 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 and again, you reference some of the evidence that's within your answer, you still get the marks. So you don't gain or lose marks for whether or not they agree with your conclusion, just whether or not it is based on the evidence that you've already presented. Anytime you have a 4 to 6 mark question, it's not a bad idea to start with a plan. So what I would do if I was writing up a question that said evaluate the use of vaccines, I would make a little table. I would say plus, I would say minus, and then I would start to write down some of my arguments. So for example, for plus, I might say provides immunity, I might say protects unvaccinated through herd immunity. For my negatives, I might say some people can have bad reactions. And then I can write my conclusion. You'll notice that I didn't give an equal number of pluses and minuses. You don't necessarily have to give 2 and 2 or 3 and 3. What you have to make sure of is that you are giving at least one positive and at least one negative for both sides. And then at the end, you write your conclusion. So you might start your answer with advantages of vaccines are, and then you could just fill in your positives. You might say disadvantages are, and then put in your negatives, and then you could go and write in conclusion and write your conclusion, and you would get full marks. Okay? For the outcomes, looking back at what we did, we were talking about what is in a vaccine. We talked about how vaccines provide immunity, and we tied that back to last lesson and the idea of memory cells and antibodies. And evaluate the use of vaccines. And we need to remember for evaluate, you need to give a plus, you need to give a minus, and you need to make a conclusion at the end. For the work off the back of this lesson, I'm going to give you some past paper questions that cover this and the immune response, so the stuff from lesson number 3. Thank you for listening. I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.